It is now my great pleasure to introduce Deborah Jack. Deborah, I've known her work and I've known Deborah now for several years. It's been truly a pleasure, and I think you have a great evening in store. Deborah's work dazzles with its intelligence and poeticism, and through a juxtaposition of images and videos, she brings together disparate geographies, and in doing so, opens our eyes to ways to think differently about coastlines, colonial histories, and even our relationship to water. If you've not seen her exhibition at MCA, The Haunting of Estuaries, An Aftermath of Confluence, you have 2 more weeks. It closes on February 15th. And as a reminder, if you bring your ticket from tonight's program, you receive free admission to MCA. So no excuses. Deborah is from a St. Martin and Jersey City-based artist whose work is based in video and sound installation, photography, painting, and text. Her work frequently employs video as one of her strategies for mining the intersections of histories, cultural memory, ecology, and climate change. Her current practice connects the effects of the hurricane storm surge in relation to coastal erosion, the saltwater inundation of intertidal spaces. She imagines these protective intersectional landscapes and wetlands as sites of resistance. Her work has been featured in significant exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, ICA Boston, the Houston Center of Photography, and other renowned institutions. In fall 2021, a retrospective, Deborah Jack, 20 Years, was presented at Pen and Brush in New York City. Her work is in the collections of MCA Chicago, the Des Moines Art Center, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, and the Smith College Museum of Art. Deborah was a 2023 Changing Climate Residence at the Santa Fe Art Institute and a Surf Point Foundation Artist in Residence. She is a recipient of a 2024 fellowship from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, a Soros Art Fellow from 2023, and she is currently a professor of art at New Jersey City University. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Jack.
Good evening. I like to get right to it, so thanks for having me. Happy to be here in Denver. Cultivating the archipelago. How to grow in these assaulted islands, to be planted in unknown land, unfamiliar soil, by hostile hands. We become garden and gardeners, from growing wild on hillsides with weeds that flower, our roots busting up ruins, outlasting structures of empire, to coastline gardens with plants that protect, watered by the sea and rains. We are intertidal imaginaries. Cultivate resistance in roots and rhizome. Our gardens are where we take the dust of volcanoes, the bones of our ancestors, the salt of storm and tears, and manifest fecundity. Nourish ourselves and offspring, rooting and routing the archipelago. Hills dotted in flamboyant red since June, memorials in bloom, raining petals, a bloodletting on rock walls bearing up the land, etching away to the water, the salt water of tears and sweat, erasing maps, charting an unknown sea, mare incognita in our blood. To meet our ancestors riding underwater oscillations, their hum a talisman of sound guiding us to come find them. The sea is a prayer that held us in its hold, held in her embrace, rocking us, bathing us with salt, keeping us cleansed while in the rot. The sea is a prayer. The sea is a work song, keeping time with our hearts, beating, biding time, the salt forming an armor, the cotton to remind us, the indigo a talisman. The sea is a work song. The sea is an elegy, honoring our dead, raising them up from the seafloor. The salt of their blood is still in the ocean, kissing our shores, every wave a hymn, every tide a poem. The sea is an elegy. The sea is a praise song, humming a hymn our ears don't hear, using the submerged geography of the archipelago to navigate the stars. The sea is a praise song. My work has been a direct reference to the Atlantic hurricanes that serve as a manifestation of a memorial to the Black Atlantic, the Middle Passage. For me, the connection is salt, the salt of the St. Martin plantation industry, the salt of the sea, the salt of sweat and tears, the salt that inhabits the rain during a hurricane. The salt is material, metaphor, and a conceptual point of departure. The interactions of history, memory, and nature create a counter-narrative to the so-called facts of the historical archive. So I've added my own truths, my own constructed histories. The residual traces of traumatic historical events in personal and cultural memory in my community is also centered in the work. It's a result of my investigation of the tension that exists in spaces that are once sites of trauma and sites of healing. Toni Morrison's concept of the rememory, renewed or remembered memory, serves as a catalyst and a means for restoring and resuturing this dismemberment of histories, cultures, traditions, families, and personal memories.
Let Martha go home. Pomalia la, pe. Pomalia la, pain in me belly. Pomalia la, no younger soul.
It shouldn't loop. So the water between us remembers, so we carry this history on our skins, long for a sea bath, and hope that the salt will cure what ails us. It's a 3-channel installation, but it's also a single channel. A lot of times I do both. I do a multi-channel version and then also a single channel sort of interpretation, but that functions as its own piece as well. This, though, is a combination of clips. The full piece is about 15 minutes. So the images that you saw in the beginning, too, are part of a series of still photos that are called "What is the Value of Water If It Doesn't Quench Our Thirst For?" And so this presents a narrative of a young girl who is both ancestor and descendant. It's her journey around the island, and here the island represents a place that is both disconnected and connected. Her journey begins inland, and she makes her way to the shoreline, only to return to the center and go back and forth. Her impulse to perform this ritual is a form of remembering what was lost, taken, forgotten, traveling across visible and invisible boundaries towards the shore. The flowers are metaphors for both the wounds of history combined with the beauty of regeneration. Roots dig deep, the tree is nurtured, and blossoms erupt on hillsides and valleys in flesh. It's a season of bloom. These visual stories illustrate and give space to the possibility that nature creates her own memorials in the places where they resonate the most. These memorials aren't fixed. They're cycles that are embedded in weather patterns and the seasons of places that play out on land and the sea of this particular space. The nature is a living memorial, and the site I've decided to excavate is St. Martin, the Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, and sort of want to explore the resonance that this place can have, and how these traces can embed themselves in the land, but also on the body. So as I think about how nature absorbs and repels large and small atrocities of history and creates its own memorials and demands that we create our own rituals as well, it looks at the residue of the shared memories that are triggered as a result of those events. So I'm trying to articulate the both historical and cultural injury, also in a way that tries to avoid and subvert images of suffering and victimhood that can be used as visual hot buttons and ways to illustrate. I'm not interested in showing Black bodies in pain. Key aspects of this sort of dichotomy, I think, lives in the Caribbean landscape. The vital foliage cloaks the soil that nurtures and buries our histories. The underlying foundation then is to use the sea and the land to think through these ideas. And sometimes there's a presence of the body and sometimes not. That particular piece actually is one of the only pieces that sort of have a figure in it. So the hurricane then is my answer to the question that Emna Borsi Phillips asked in her work Zong. How does one retrieve Black bodies from the sea, this liquid grave? Her word is exaqua. Christine Sharp credits scientist Anne Goldusky, who states that the human body would not make it to the seafloor intact, and the atoms of the enslaved thrown overboard or who jumped are still in the ocean. Then what is the rain in a hurricane? What is the storm surge pushing the Black Atlantic past our shorelines, if not a reckoning, a seasonal haunting? This relation to the storm surge that occurs during the hurricanes, this destructive wall of water that is caused by the hurricane force winds that push the seawater towards the coast. If the Black Atlantic is the site where the bodies lost during the Middle Passage reside, and the hurricane then is the embodiment of this loss, the raising up of these bodies from the sea is what I consider then to be this ex aqua.
Bomalia lao, let Martha go home. Bomalia lao, pain. Bomalia lao, pain in me belly. Bomalia lao, no younger soul.
In Demonic Grounds, Catherine McKittrick positions Black women's geographies as a counter to geography with a capital G. This work of mine then continues to evolve, pushing me to explore the notion of the shoreline as an unmappable site, that the erosions that happen when land and water meet, that site of dialectic resonance that Brathwaite talks about, intersects with what Catherine McKittrick calls the ungeographic. The island space is rich for this. The edges are rich. These islands that are at the edge of precarity. The archipelago, then, to me, is also a protective ecology. These islands are poems where fragmentation forges a whole. The submarine landscape of the region gives birth to the Rosby whistle, a sound created by the westward movement of massive submarine wave from the Atlantic across the Caribbean basin, and its movement back over the course of 120 days. This frequency escapes our spectrum of hearing, but it radiates into outer space. It's a presence we cannot see or hear, an invisible route perhaps, mapped by the submarine topography of the Caribbean. So the sound that you hear in that video, and also in the one before, and in the next video, is sort of a rendering of what the Rosby whistle would sound like. So the next video that you look at, Drawn by Water, sea drawings in 3 acts. Act 1, wait on the water. In here I see the shoreline of the island and the land as a liminal space, the fluidity of the water as it interacts with the shore, and the lines that are created, that encounter as well as the temporary quality of those lines, how the constant shifting of water in the sea foam creates marks that are always in motion. I was exploring the relationship of the natural world to memory and abstraction. How can the collision of the sea with the shore cause subtle erosions that serve as a metaphor for the erosions of memory? Climate change and its effects on the rising sea levels and coastal erosion make this interplay even more important. It calls on us to examine our relationship to the sea and our increasing vulnerability. The video shows Scheveningen Beach in the Netherlands, and the segments of water then are from St. Martin. The sound is a modification of the Rosby whistle, and sort of, for me, it functions as an archipelagic song. Someday I'll get it right. Let's see. Nope. Doesn't want to play.
There you go.
The piece was first made, also, I was already experimenting with sort of using these rectangular shapes in the work. This is the first project where I started using sort of geometric shapes that would appear in the video work. Initially, when I was sort of playing around and experimenting with it before I thought about a project, it was to think about this idea of could video function as the way paintings did, sort of with abstraction. During my sort of working with this, St. Martin was hit in 2017 by a hurricane, Hurricane Irma, that was devastated the island. And so and just sort of thinking through the politics of what was happening in the region for the island at the time, the work sort of shifted to then a kind of a critique. And thinking then about this idea of shared vulnerabilities. St. Martin is a Dutch colony, but about, this idea then of 1/3 of the Netherlands is also below sea level, with its highest point being about 22 feet below sea level, its lowest point, and the highest point being 1,000 feet above sea level. So 26% of this area and the 21% of the population of the Netherlands is below the sea level. And so when thinking about the Netherlands and how they were sort of dealing, a lot of times when you have a Caribbean island get hit by a storm, questions start to rise about the corruption of politics as opposed to emergency aid, and discussions happen about whether you're worthy of financial aid during an emergency. And so the work, while listening to this happening, the work shifted and started thinking then about the shared vulnerabilities between the colonizer and the colonized in a situation when the rise of sea level threatens both of us. The work also was this thinking further about the Black Atlantic as being both expansive and specific, and that all the water on the planet cycles through the oceans. And so if that's the case, then the water off the coast of St. Martin has also touched the coast of the Netherlands. So drawn by water, sea drawings in 3 acts. This is Act 2, Saltwater Requiem, and then the wind whispered, sometimes the aftermath is the storm. I wanted to think further about the aftermath, and that line, sometimes the aftermath is the storm, was something I had posted after watching all the sort of confusion and sort of disorganization that was happening, and anger and sort of rumors that were spreading on Facebook, and I just sort of posted, it's like, wow, sometimes the aftermath is the storm, and then incorporated it into the title of the piece. And thinking about what happened with the closing of the borders, so St. Martin is part French, part Dutch, part run by the French and part a Dutch colony. And during the storm, they decided to close the borders between the islands. St. Martin is 37 square miles. Families are mixed, people live on one side, work on the other side. So the people are intermingled, but the politics of the island are, what I consider an exercise in colonial absurdity. And so they closed the border, and when they did this, they split, and it was the idea of the colonial powers said that they were trying to protect the aid. So the French wanted the aid to only go to the French side, and the Dutch wanted to make sure that only the Dutch side got the aid that they gave. But however, this split families and stopped people from getting to work, children to school, and because the community lives in a way that defies borders and is completely intermingled. And so for me, the border is what then, again, functions as this ungeographic site, and what scholar Cecilia Godino calls an unsovereign element. This imposition of a grid or a line on people, on the landscape, is something that this project is continually investigating. So the images are both of the shoreline in both the north and south of St. Martin. That's the way a lot of us on the island refer to it, as opposed to Dutch and French. We say north, which is the French part, and the south is the Dutch part. And thinking about how that shoreline between both of those and that we share is constantly defying borders and these sort of artificial lines that are made on the landscape. Part of this work in the video that you saw before, too, is because I think that the coastline is where maps are incorrect, right? This idea of mapping and grids that were made for sort of a colonial extractive project fail at the coastline because of these microerosions. That line isn't fixed, It's a site of fluidity and constant change. And so to me, that constantly challenges then the sort of capitalist colonial constructs. So in this work, I wanted to also wanted it to be more immersive. So where Wait on the Water, Act 1 was a single channel, this is now a 3-channel, and that people could sort of walk into this space and be immersive. So this is just a segment. What is the role that water plays in our collective cultures? To be surrounded by it is to be aware of the scale. If you live on an island, especially a small island, you're always aware of the edges of your land. A line, you can also see the horizon, another line. I wanted to consider this as a form of mark making that occurs in nature. These are the lines that actually are real. I wanted the viewer to sit in the space and shift their visual perspective somewhat, their relationship to the space they believe they already know. So in Act 2, there are panels of water that are shifting back and forth, and that are all water from the French side of the island, the Dutch side of the island, and in the little orange box is the coastline of the Netherlands. So in that case, it's reduced to this sort of orange box, and the orange then has to do with the Royal House of Orange. So if you've ever noticed that the Dutch national teams all wear orange instead of red, white, and blue, it's because the Royal House is the House of Orange Nassau. So orange, I got the Pantone official color and put that in the piece. So the orange, so even the colors aren't arbitrary, they actually are then connected to, there's a reason behind the sort of, there's a moment where that orange rectangle just takes over the space. The sound includes the Rosby whistle again, and this sort of droning functions then as the sonic foundation of the piece, again tying it to this idea of this united sound that comes from the region that's natural and not based on a nation state. The second layer of the sound is a hymn called Let Your Lower Lights Be Burning, which is slowed down really painfully slow, and then distorted. And so if you've noticed in a couple of the videos, there's a kind of, I like to use distortion to disrupt sort of like the beauty that you're seeing in the images. Glitches are intentional, so when you hear them, they do make you start a bit, and that's on purpose, because I'm not trying to lull you and sort of comfort you. It's meant to sort of be disruptive and function that way. And so I've always found the hymn, though, to be poignant and wanted to use it. The song is about a beacon in the aftermath of a storm or wreckage. And so the third movement of the piece, of all this, is then an original composition where I wanted something to be more melodic and hopeful. So the tones shift and they're not as heavy. It's a bit lighter. So there's a sort of movement that goes through the entire then installation. The third in the series, Drawn by Water, Act 3, is Sinking. I remembered that the embrace of oceans is the love I know, and yearned for a familiar shore that. And it's inspired in part by a line in Derek Walcott's poem, The Schooner Flight. In this section, it's a longer poem, but this section is like, as I worked, watching the rotting waves come past a bow that scissor the sea like silk, I swear to you all by my mother's milk, by the stars that shall fly from tonight's furnace, that I love them, my children, my wife, my home. I love them as poets love the poetry that kills them, as drowned sailors the sea. The third act is the only piece that has a trace of the body in it. Footsteps in the sand, you see the tip of a foot. There's the suggestion of the body. The sound is a man-made sound, which is bass feedback. And it doesn't matter, but as a contrast then to the Rosby whistle. Brace yourselves. Sometimes the work's about endurance. So my collages, I sort of, to give a break from all the video, I also work with collage and I've looked at a lot of satellite images, the surface of the sea, and for me it was sort of, I'm always thinking about how can I think about some of these ideas in other mediums. And so sometimes when I'm working on the video, these function sometimes as sketches, as a way for me to sort of just process an idea. So the blue lines that you see there are actually then printouts of the audio files that are in my video edits. A lot of times I was raving to a friend, I was like, the beauty of my timeline, my editing timeline. It's just it's a technical thing, right? So I'm like, the cuts that people don't get to see, it's kind of like the skeleton to the body of the work. You see the video, but I am always sitting with the timeline, and sometimes that looks beautiful to me. And so she's like, oh, so why don't you make that visible? And I was like, I don't know. But then it got me thinking about the fact that this too was a line, and this too is a kind of drawing, and playing with the notion that a sound that's technically not visible can be made visible, and so I wanted to play with that in the collages. And then give them really long titles, as you see that I like. It's one way to exercise the poetry. Somebody asked me, especially when I did the water between us, remember? So we wear the history on our skin and hope the salt will cure it us. And they said, why? And I said, because I got to Untitled 49. So I thought I should do better since I use words. And so once I started with that, it was all downhill, so I apologize. But this image is Hurricane Maria that hit the devastated Puerto Rico and also had hit us, but not as hard. And so the work, though, that the song The Tempest sings, Travel the Undercurrents of to be heard, has again to do with this notion of the Atlantic, right? And sort of that these storms are driven by ocean currents, and the same ocean currents and winds that brought slave ships from the coast of Africa to the New World, right? And so that's sort of my interest in the storm and the aftermath and all things around the storms. So the collages function as just a way for me to sort of process these ideas in another medium that sometimes comes back in the videos and sometimes not. There's no gold leaf in the video, but you know. It's also too, like, I don't necessarily like video stills as prints, and so this is a way for me to sort of think about what am I trying to say in the video in another medium. So the collages use archival maps of the Dutch in the Americas and wanted to explore further this idea of mare incognita. And so, and in some cases, terra incognita. So in old maps, you would see this word terra incognita, and you'd see sort of like the cities, and they would name things, and then there was this sort of unknown land, and they would mark it as terra incognita. And so when I kept running into that phrase, I was wondering, do they have something like that for the sea? And then I found mare incognita, and so I like words, I like how it sounds. So I thought about that idea of unknown, but then unknown to who? That these spaces have been navigated, right? But they're just unknown to the map makers, but they're not necessarily unknown. So me sort of cutting into the maps and fragmenting the maps is also a way of trying to like reclaim that idea of ownership of the land. The red flowers that you see in this collage are sort of the same red flowers that are in the video that you saw before. And that's a flower from the flamboyant tree, the Grand Poinciana, that blooms only in July, really. Sometimes it starts late June if it's hot enough, but usually it's full bloom in July, and then usually there's some sort of wind and thunderstorm, and then first week of August, they're gone. And so this is part of my investigation too, in this idea of nature creating its own sort of seasons, its own memorials. And so for us in St. Martin, those branches were broken off when emancipation came to St. Martin. The Dutch actually tried to hide it to try and get one more harvest of salt. But on the French side of the island, they had already emancipated their enslaved people. And so word spread. And so on the Dutch side, they left. They walked off the plantation and in celebration broke these branches off and waved them. And so I'm interested in how does nature, people use something as beautiful and innocuous as a flower and it's still tied to this sort of darker history and how do, they reuse that. But also that idea of that's a season. Reading an early essay by Derek Walcott talked about this idea that, art historians thought that the Caribbean wasn't capable of abstraction because we didn't have 4 seasons like you had in Europe. Like those 4 seasons gave a depth to artwork. And Walcott was like, well, actually, the Caribbean does have seasons. We have multiple seasons. We have rainy season, there's a dry season, there's fly season, there's, these little flies show up. It's annoying. There's mango season. There are all these subtle seasons. And so flamboyance then for me became a representation of this kind of nuanced seasons that happen, that mark, that have meaning. So for instance, if we have like a really big mango season, people think that means we'll have more hurricanes, so they also have meaning. So there is depth, there's just more subtle, and that nuance is what I'm interested also in just exploring and challenging those notions of a single season in the tropics, right? It's just always sunny. Oops, it's the same. So these, I think I can go back one, yeah, because I like that one. So these images, the salt in our blood, the salt in the sea in our blood, is going to be 1, 2, and 3, same title. And so these are images that I took of the surface of the water. Again, interested in that sort of movement. I think abstraction happens in this space. It's just like you have to pay attention to it. So again, initially I was like, oh, as a photographer, I think the surface of water should be enough. Like we can do, like that's an image in and of itself, and I don't have to add anything to that. And then of course I added things to it. But again, it was this thinking about the natural world to memory and abstraction. It's in dialogue also with the history of photography. The use of salt to reveal and sort of fix was an early form of the media. Salt paper prints. Salt was used by William Henry Fox Talbot. I'm being a photo nerd, but to develop photography. So thinking about the use of salt and how it is tied to that history of photography, and then wanting to try and photograph what's unphotographable. And so this is an imaginary space, again, resisting this idea of the grid, but the images are in black and white, because also in this exploration is thinking about this idea of the abyss. And in the collage before, there's also text written in there, and one of them says, the abyss is not absence. The gold leaf also harkens to the fact that the Dutch, so there was a point in time in history where salt was more valuable than gold, and the Dutch actually built their empire on salt, and the plantation industry of salt helped to create the golden age in the Netherlands that they take great pride in. And so these works where I'm using gold leaf together with the salt, it's having a conversation of what's valuable, right? Is the gold more valuable than the salt? You have to use real gold if you're putting it on salt, because fake gold leaf that will tarnish, so you have to use actual salt, otherwise it tarnishes. And so thinking about that value, what we consider to be value, is 18-karat gold more valuable than salt? We need salt to live, we don't need gold to live, right? To survive in our bodies. Our bodies are made up of salt. So which one actually has value? So it's having these sort of little conversations within the work as well. All right, back to video. So this piece, the fecund, the lush, and the salted land waits for a harvest. Her people, ripe with promise, wait for the next blowing season. This piece incorporates video and still images. It uses Dutch archival videos of colonial footage of labor in a salt pond, and juxtaposes it with the lush flora of the land. This is in keeping with sort of this thinking about the history of extraction capitalism as you sort of remove the salt as experienced by smaller landscapes. The unearthing of these images was something in and of itself, because I found this footage during COVID, and up until I found this film, nobody had ever seen it on the island. I asked all the historians, and I said, do you know that there's this old film of St. Martin from the 1940s? And everyone says, no, it doesn't exist. And I found it because during the lockdown, I was scrolling, and a real estate agent was bemoaning the changes in the Caribbean island and looking for a simpler time like this. And she put this video up, and I was like, that's not St. Martin, it can't be. But then I looked at the landscape, and I was like, that is St. Martin. Why don't I know this exists? And so we had time during that time, and so I did research and found that I know that the Dutch are really good about archiving. You know, I tell people all the time, like, you know, this history is not hidden. It's right there. They archived it all because it was business. And so I reached out to them, and, you know, between the two of us looking on in their archives, we found the film that was made in 1942. There was a film that was commissioned to show the people back in the Netherlands what their colonies were about. And so it covered sort of, you know, the kids, the people were at work, and there's a narrator in Dutch, the Dutch David Attenborough, who is narrating it in a very pleasant voice. And so I wanted to erase the narration of the documentary because it kept calling us subjects and in Dutch. And there was actually a section where I had to ask my brother, because his Dutch is way better than mine. And I said, is he saying what I think he's saying in this part? And my brother was like, yeah. And so there's a section where he goes, and the locals missed the glorious days of when they were working on the plantation. Life was so great. And I was like, and so I really thought I was misunderstanding it. And he was like, no, that's what he's saying. So I erased his voice. And the voice that you hear in the piece then is of the late Miss Elise Hyman, who worked in the salt ponds as a girl. And her voice opens the piece, and then she brings in the sea. When I did the piece and I found her voice, I work with sort of historical historians and naturalists at home, and I was sort of like, hey, do you have? I know one was collecting kind of oral histories of somebody who worked in the pond, and he sent me her voice, Miss Elise Hyman, and it turned out she was the first cousin of my grandmother. My mom ended up telling me. So I put her voice in and so she's the only voice you hear, which is a voice of a St. Martiner. Another thing about the piece was that this is also this sort of post-slavery use of salt, where at this point the locals had turned it into a cottage industry for themselves. And so I wanted to sort of also reclaim salt from plantation, the conversation around the plantation, and to show how the people were using it as a way they exported it for their own and created their own industry, and that tension that happens in the piece. And so the musical composition that you'll hear is a piece called From Sustaining Air by Che Buford, who let me use it for the piece. And the element then of to create a kind of lightness in the strings, but there's also kind of a sense of anticipation that felt hopeful to me.
I can tell a little bit of the salt pond, what I know. In that time, in the salt pond time, they were good times. They were good times. The people was very industrious, and they didn't have no other alternative but the salt pond. And everybody used to work their own garden. Everybody worked their own garden. And when the time come for the salt, because you had to promote, you couldn't leave the salt pond just run like that. The sea go in, come out, go in, come out. It had to be taken care of.
So the work ends with the interior image of the pomegranate opened. And so those orange fruit that you were seeing were actually pomegranates. I'd never seen orange ones before. But this work was filmed during the lockdown as well. I got these snippets of video. These pomegranates seemed like so hopeful and beautiful in the midst of death counts that were showing up on TV every day. And so I filmed it, not quite sure what I was going to do with it. But pomegranates have this sort of duality that salt also has, right? Where salt corrodes and it preserves. The pomegranates symbolize both life and death, fertility and infertility. And so I felt that it spoke to me in that way. And so I have to admit that was longer than I thought it was. It was supposed to be a shorter clip, but then so I'll skip this part and just show this. And then, so there's also then a single channel version that I was going to show you, but since that's so long, we can skip that. But there is a single channel version of the piece, and it's a sister piece, so I should stop myself from saying it's a version. And it has a completely different title. So the fecund memory of sky and salt, the amnesia, a history unreversed, rehearsed, still lush. And so the idea then, the challenge of sort of thinking about the same ideas and putting it in one piece and also then adding their other elements in terms of the audio. You hear Miss Elise again in the piece, and then some different configurations. One of the things that I did like about the piece was that the women that are in it are usually moving across the screen and sort of function as a kind of transition tool. But keeping an eye on time. And this piece also, the previous installation, also had a poem that was also on the wall. It said, "Between sky and salt, dry season and the sea, a murder of unnoticed atrocities linger, suspended in silver halide crystals, made dark by the light that washes away what becomes shadow. The rainy season readies us, the blowing season carries. A body in water is not weightless, but lifted, floating in an in-between, a negotiation. Between the cover and pages are the marks that try to maim us, the gentle amputations of math that erode geographies, that divide, and the amnesia of an unspoken history." And so that was sort of my response to having to go through the archives and having this archive exist away from the people, right? The archive is in the Netherlands, and the people who are in the archive don't even know that those images are there, both still and video. So it talks about that kind of erasure and that removal of history. And so the work is partly putting that back together, but then remaking it. So thinking about the hurricane, wanting to delve further, I started thinking about the surge again and what happens during the storm surge. I was always interested in it. Now more than ever, we see storm surge videos on TV more and more. But having lived through the aftermath of a 20-foot storm surge and what that does to the edges and the structures on the edges led me to the intertidal Imaginaries series. And the full work is Intertidal Imaginaries, the resistant geographies of the shore, coast, in the aftermath of saltwater storm surges. So thinking about the warming of the ocean, which has led to hurricanes that are more explosive in strength, last longer, push further inland, the mangrove and other intertidal flora as protective zones is a newer direction in my work. The plant life that has a higher tolerance for salt water, but not the force of the surge, and how that's reforming the coastline. While these plants can survive in the salinity, if it's too high, it chokes off the plant's vascular systems. The rhizomatic nature of these plant systems, especially the mangroves, are then spaces that I felt that I could use. A lot of Caribbean scholars think about the Caribbean also as a rhizome, that the islands are connected underneath, and that the islands that you see are actually the mountaintops of a united submarine land. And so the rhizome is something that conceptually is something that you find repeats itself in Caribbean literature and writing. So I've been looking at intertidal spaces, especially these mangroves, and how they protect from hurricanes and storm surge, and thinking about the devastation that happens when the surge of the ocean floods these spaces. And so these images then are of structures, hotels, most of them. Most locals don't build on the coastline or on the waterfront. These are all people with too much money and hotels. And so this hotel in particular, I had never seen it before the hurricane, but you could tell it was beautiful. I mean, marble slabs everywhere, giant pieces of wood that were the rafters or just pushed into the corner. Like it had just been abandoned, however it was in the aftermath. Some people took, furniture and tiles to put in their homes afterwards, since they realized no one was coming. But I was interested in this sort of removal of what happens in these spaces when we put architecture and we put these structures in these intertidal zones where there's usually a wetland. How does the architecture and the infrastructure survive or not survive, and what happens and how is it transformed when sort of left alone? So this was a pool, and I always tell people if you just go 4 inches in the image, you're on the beach, the sand comes up to the pool, and so to a local person that feels absurd, but. I guess you pay extra for that. And so this, roll out the pool into the sea. That's what I imagine. And so this was also a structure. This is a place that we all used to go and have parties. It was a bar and a restaurant with a second floor, and this is all that remained. So in this, it's sort of, again, in this work is where the video kind of informed the still work, thinking about those geometric shapes and this sort of removal of color or addition of color and the sort of push and pull that happens in these images. So interestingly enough, this landscape is now gone. They're building a hotel. And so they completely destroyed this pond that was a natural sort of water capture for when a surge would come in, it would go into that pool and that landscape, and now a new luxury hotel has scraped away all of that. And they're building right on the coast again. It's a beautiful runway for a storm surge, but each unit will cost $900,000. So, but it's right on the water, right, and they flattened all of this. So again, when I'm making this work, I go to these sites and you think you come back in 6 months and it'll be there, and then it was actually gone. I mean, it was really actually devastating. I say it with a smile, but I was upset, to say the least. But I was glad then that I captured it. I also have it in video, so I guess it lives on. And so part of the work in this whole series, even though there are those images with the color removed, there's also several black and white images of sort of the aftermath of the storm surge and how the landscape is transformed, how the mangrove, the image on the, is that your right, couldn't absorb the storm surge, right, and couldn't function as a protective landscape really, or if it did, then it didn't really survive. It's still trying to recover, 5 years later. And so I just wanted, for context, there was an article that showed, this beach was a beautiful sort of blue beach. They called it Baby Beach because you didn't get any, there was a breakout by the reef, and so the water, and the waves never came in, so little kids could swim, and it was always shallow, and really bright blue and clear, and now it's murky and dark, and it's deep, and no one swims there anymore. A few people do, but not locals. But that's an article that's showing what happened. And then again, this is an example of the landscape before and then after the hurricane, and how, it just can't absorb the energy of the storm surge and how the landscape shifts. So I'm also working on looking at this sort of transformation of the landscape and how it doesn't recover, right? We think it will, but it doesn't recover, but it shifts and becomes something else. And so for me, these intertidal spaces are then places where cartography and geography are disrupted in the aftermath of these storms. Toni Morrison talks about when the Mississippi, when it floods, that it's actually remembering, right? And the flooding is a memory. So then, for me, then the storm surge is a kind of remembering as well. The sort of influx of water, even though it's temporary, and the sudden erasure of the shoreline that happens during and sometimes before the hurricane is the sea, the Black Atlantic, making itself known, imprinting itself on the landscape, the infrastructure, and the architecture, even as it erases it. So the coastlines are sites of resistance to me, and so even though there's always erosion, there's always regeneration that happens. The landscape doesn't stay traumatized. These images are also part of that series, and so these are interior spaces of like homes that are impacted long-term. So there's salt water in the hurricane, in the rain, and so, it gets into the walls, and years later, this will happen to the paint. And so I was sort of also looking, even though I was looking at exterior spaces and the landscape, I wanted to think about other protective landscapes, and to me, the home is sort of a personal embodiment of that, and the impact that the storm can have, besides sort of a roof being removed, even if the roof doesn't go, that it comes through the walls. So this is just another example. Just moving through. This is sort of how the work gets presented, sort of different installation modes, so it's never sort of linear. I'm looking at the time, so it's left time. All right. So this is a newer piece that goes along with the intertidal video. I have it this way so you can sort of see how it can be presented, like on opposing walls. It's just really hard to see the work together that way, but I have it this way so you can see. But to make it easier, I'm doing a side-by-side. Because I want you to sort of see the relationship between the two screens, and it's better if I do it this way. To the work that's in the MCA Denver. A sea desalts, creeping in the collapse, in the expanse, a rhizome looks for reason, whispers an elegy instead. So now that I've said all this other stuff, now the title might make more sense to you. It's sort of like a combination of a lot of this work that I'm thinking through. And so this 6-channel video installation it was a commission, and so it was one of those things where I was already working on gathering some images. I tend to film what interests me in the moment. I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do with the clips when I film them. So in that video before, where you saw the rain falling on the wall, I was sitting on my mom's porch and I saw the rain and I thought it was beautiful. And I was like, if it's framed just so. And so I capture it, and it sat in my hard drive for, 2 years maybe, before I used it. So even the water of the coastline, I film the beach and the edges every time I go home. I film a clip on some level. I'm not quite sure how I'm ever going to incorporate it. But most of my work has been around the edges of St. Martin and then the Netherlands. And so this piece was a great opportunity then for me to explore other edges and other coastlines that are also dealing with climate change and the inundation of water and salt water that was happening in these spaces. And so it was a unique opportunity to work with scientists and geologists, why can't I say the word now? All of a sudden. All right, well, scientists Alex Kolker and David Baker, who study the geography of Louisiana, and have conversations with them. And so when I went came to Louisiana to film, I knew about the land loss, right? Louisiana loses 3 football fields of land every half an hour. It's true, look it up. And so it sounds outrageous when you hear it, but it's happening. So when I went, I was like, okay, I'm gonna make work about saltwater inundation. The saltwater inundation is what's killing our mangroves in St. Martin, and I know it's creating sort of like ghost forests in New Orleans, and I thought, okay, this is a good way to sort of bring this together and think about the shared vulnerabilities that we have. Because my interest is sort of the Atlantic and the water ways that are impacted or that have a relation to the Atlantic, each one of these sites are having a kind of conversation. Probably the only one that doesn't then is like Mississippi and the Gulf. And wanted to have them in conversation with each other. And so there's images from St. Martin, from Belém in Brazil, where the water there is the river where the Atlantic Ocean is entering sort of the river system that leads to the Amazon River. And so I wanted that water is a mixture then of the salt water and the fresh water. The images from New Orleans are of the Neptune Pass, which was a site that, the pass is like between the Mississippi River is a body, like a little canal in a way, natural canal, that goes between the river and the bay. The Neptune Pass was about 175 feet wide, not particularly a big pass, but during COVID, over a 5-year period, it expanded to 800 feet wide. Nobody really knows why. And it's about 100 feet deep. So the energy that passes through that pass is 5 times the power of the Hudson River. And so if you could imagine that increase then pulls sediment out into the bay and started to create a new delta. So the conversation that I was having with Alex Kolker led, when I was thinking about land loss, he said, well, it's also making land if you leave it alone. And he talked about Mardi Gras Pass, which was a site where one of the levees broke. And the University of Tulane asked the Army Corps of Engineers to not develop it any further, like to leave it, don't fix it, and let's see what the river does. And the river built up the land. All of this is, of course, in opposition then to sort of, Louisiana investing $2.9 billion in a diversion, which is this sort of man-made attempt to build the land up that's disappearing. And here the river was doing it like for free. But because that land is being formed in the middle of a shipping lane for fossil fuels, they don't want that land to be built there, right? And so to fight that delta that's being built, that's forming out in the bay, they started putting boulders in the pass to make it not so deep. So it became, I think it's about 80 feet when I last visited. And so the images are of Neptune Pass, and you sort of see these little pods, which are these little islands that form when the water is low enough, usually around like January, March. And then when I went back, there was grass that was forming on those, and there were like animals walking around. So, so that idea of land being formed was one that was counter to like my preconceived sort of like idea about what I was going to film. And then there's like that little cutout in the corner is actually an aerial view of a place called Lake Peigneur. And so Lake Peigneur is not in New Orleans, it's in Jefferson County Islands, and that is a lake that was about 10 feet deep. It was a freshwater lake of no consequence really, but it was sat above the Morton salt mine. And so Morton salt that you get in your supermarket, and that was where they got that salt, and it was one of the purest salt mines in the world. And it was 1,000 feet deep underneath this 10-foot body of water. On a particular day, Texaco asked to speculate to see if there was oil nearby. And so the person who's operating the drill, nobody really admits to what happens, but an accident happened and he read the map wrong, those maps again. And he ended up drilling and cracking the dome of the mine. When the mine cracked, the water started coming in. Of course, water and salt dissolves, so the opening just kept getting bigger. And an electrician happened to see it and got everybody out in time, so nobody in the mine died. And for a time, the largest man-made whirlpool in the United States happened as that lake emptied down into the mine. It created then the tallest waterfall in Louisiana. While it was cascading into the mine, the suction, the force of that water collapsing into the opening actually then reversed the flow of a nearby canal that was flowing from the Mississippi to the Gulf, and so it flowed from the Gulf in, and so it filled in that absence, right? And so the Gulf flowed into that opening, into where the lake was, and after 3 hours, you ended up with a saltwater pond, and about 60 acres of land went into the hole. The barges, like 13 barges, barrels for oil, the drill, all went into that opening. So it wasn't a tiny hole at all. It swallowed everything. There was only one, there's a survivor, this poor guy who was fishing almost got sucked into the opening, but a barge covered it, and for that split second, he was able to gun his motor and get out of the flow. If you look it up on YouTube, he's hilarious. He has a hat that said, "I survived the Lake Peigneur disaster." But for me, when I was doing research, going down to Louisiana, it was interesting that here you had this moment that was, so in 3 hours, the thing happened, and it took about 2 weeks to fully settle. But at the end, Lake Peigneur was like a 600-foot lake that went from fresh water to salt water. It changed the plant ecology, the fishes, all the animals around it shifted. And so I used it because it was something that was cataclysmic and quick, whereas the saltwater inundation that was creating these sort of ghost forests was just something that was more gradual. And so I wanted to have, while we were having this sort of slow, images of the water and we were moving through this space, that there was also this catastrophe that was sort of documented that's moving through the piece. And so the aerial footage that you see, there's a kaleidoscope moment that's from Lake Peigneur. That's an aerial shot of a little island that remains in Lake Peigneur. And so you've seen this part. So I also use text in the work as well, the poetry. Incorporating that, there's a poem in the space that's reflective, that uses the light of the video to illuminate the text, so you have to work to read it. It's playing sort of with the ideas of invisibility and visibility. So just a couple stills really from the video. So this is some of the images that were upside down. This is the forest that died because of saltwater inundation. The trees couldn't survive, so they become these sort of like skeletal trees in that space. There was a fire, so some of them have like a burnt. You'll see in the video, there's some like that look burnt, and that was because there was a fire. But these are petrified. You can't cut them down really. The sort of ghostliness of that space called to me for the piece. And it's the only sort of upside down footage in there. That was the image of the aerial view of Lake Pinure. And then sort of, again, this revisiting of the rectangular shape. The landscape, the plant that you see in the video is actually St. Martin. The trees, those plants are from St. Martin, and they're moving sort of like frenetically, and that's because it was Hurricane Ernesto, tropical storm Ernesto was coming, and so I went outside to film, because that's what I do in hurricanes. You should not. But again, revisiting the coastline. So this is the coast of Maine, which is also one of the sites that I filmed and photographed. And Maine, that area off the coast in the Bay of Bay of Maine. It's the Atlantic is warming at a faster rate than all other parts of the Atlantic. So it's not the hottest, but it's warming faster. And that is a particularly sensitive area because it affects the currents of the Atlantic. And so, it doesn't seem like much, but it has repercussions then for like the weather and ocean currents for the entire sort of Atlantic. And so you have El Nino, and as we look at the weather and we see atmospheric rivers and all this kind of stuff, and we're like, where's the water? There's a lot of water in the air, right? The atmosphere is holding a lot of water that it didn't hold before. So I filmed off the coast of Maine also too because I started seeing hurricanes go more and more north, and so last year, I believe, a hurricane went all the way to Maine. And we're seeing them go further north, and they remain tropical, but they don't become ex-tropical storms anymore. And so I felt like I should incorporate that. One of the things that you never really get to see is sort of video sketches, like how do artists make video works? And so I'm always making these sort of little vignettes. And so this was one that I made. This was one that I made for this project where when I was sort of testing out. So this is off the coast of Maine. I was there for a month in York and living literally, that was out my window. And it was also the first time I came in contact with like tides at that level. Like we have tides in St. Martin, of course, but we don't have this kind of like high tide where the entire coastline is transformed, and I'd never seen anything like that. So that rock would disappear, and then all of a sudden it would be there like 2 days later, and I was just like, what is happening? I was very worried. I thought the water could come into the house, but so this was me sort of playing with how I imagined the work to look, and I figured it'd be fun to show it. I've never shown sort of, but this project was really kind of cool. It won't play. Let's see if we do it. If we go back one more, and we go forward, and then forward. So that's, I think, my time is, am I good? Okay. So that's sort of, this of course never ends up in the piece that's on display, but it was me sort of, again, trying to work through a lot of imagery that I had collected at these sites and thinking about how they work together and how they could potentially sort of interact. And the sound is not the sound, it's an older piece that I had done. The sound in the show, that's in the piece in MCA Denver, it was composed specifically for the work. It was commissioned by the same young composer who did the sound, the piece with the pomegranates, the fecund. And so this work was done by Diaphanous Ensemble, which is a trio, and they work in a sort of space of like classical, abstract, like performance sound. And so I sent them clips, told them sort of what I was interested in, the tone I wanted. I tend to like minor keys, so I wanted it dark and sort of heavy, but then I wanted to have sort of moments of lightness, so those sort of bells that you would hear. They use sort of unorthodox sound like instruments, so they use oyster shells to create some of the sound that you would hear in the soundscape, as well as like, a little bit of chains. I told them to take the chain, to reduce that a bit. So we sent stuff back and forth because I didn't want it to be industrial, but I liked sort of the sound of it. And so we used the shells of the oysters to create the same effect. So, so thank you, that's my talk. If you have any questions.
My name is Ty. I'm the Community Outreach and Partnerships Manager. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Deborah. This was fantastic. Really appreciate you. I know we're a little bit over time, but I definitely wanted to still open it up if anybody in the audience had any questions. Maybe we have time for one or two. Definitely want to come over. Yes.
Hey, I absolutely love that. Thanks for coming to Denver. And I love that note about the paradox of the coastline, that it's always moving tidally or otherwise. And, I'm just curious, growing up in St. Martin, how you view your map of the island. If it isn't this orthographic kind of obsessive, delimiting thing that most mapping is, Well,
I think the way I grew up, because I grew up without a sense of, so St. Martin has a border, right, between the two spaces, but it's literally just a sign that says, welcome to the French side, welcome to the Dutch side. There's no control or anything like that. So borders were always curious to me because they didn't really mean anything. If I wanted to see my grandmother, just drive on a Sunday. I didn't have to get permission to cross it. So I think that idea of them being a fiction is something that I sort of just lived and didn't necessarily have the vocabulary for it, right? When you get older and I guess you go to grad school, you get the vocabulary for it. But you know what I mean? So that negotiation of those spaces, when you feel them, though, is when the colonizer shows up, right? When there's a storm or some sort of emergency where control has to be. So when they closed the border, people were like, what? We're like confused, right? Like, what is this? Why are there men with guns at our border? Like, we don't, and so people, turned cars upside down and set them on fire, because that's what you do. And then they went away. And so, and figured out a different way, right? But they had to meet with sort of like the leaders of the community who were like, we're not gonna steal from each other, right? So those are the moments when you realize when they need something, when there's sort of like an official function, when somebody goes like, oh, okay, But for the most part, so you kind of like, you don't take them as seriously, right? But they're there, and they can be constraining at times. But yeah, I think growing up with that sort of kind of an irreverence that we all had for the border and thinking of it made me go like, well, these are sites that don't really exist, right? Say it again? Totally, yes, completely permeable. By the people who live in this space, right? So it's like trying to control sort of these organic spaces, whether it's the sea or the land. It's, what's your point? No problem.
Anybody else with a question? Oh, I see my girl way back here. Let's go.
Cannot see a soul, which is probably good.
I wrote this down because I knew I was going to see you, Deborah. Actually, first I'd say thank you so much for the work that you're doing and the work that you're producing. And this is like your life's work. And I just want to say thank you for sharing that with us. I wrote this down because, I too am exploring something adjacent to this. And so here we go. So I'm curious about the life cycles of the black bodies and its tethering to the life cycle of the volcanic islands, like how it has arrived here. And I'm curious to see our relationship to land and the potential to shift and mold it through our own personal embodied movement, and how that embodied movement could potentially shift our own cartographies and how that land responds to it. My background is in urban planning and dance, and I'm curious about the two, and if you see any case studies or any life cycles that mirror the water and its edge and its impact. And that's a lot of questions, but I would love to take it for coffee. Would love a tea.
I was like, wow.
I am also a Caribbean woman, so I hear you and I see you. So,
Right, I guess I feel like I should say, come talk to me after. But I will say that I think because I think you were mentioning something about like volcanic sort of those shifts, right, in those spaces. I mean, I talk about movement, right, and in terms of the water and where that sort of fixed landscape meets the fluidity of water, because those are sort of like obvious movements, right? But the land's moving under our feet too. We just don't notice it. We notice it when it's sudden, when it's like an earthquake, right? But those shifts are kind of like happening subtly, right? When like water is pulled out of the land and you get kind of like the land starts to sink, right? And so in terms of like embodied movement, I don't know, I think like it's just how we navigate those spaces all the time. Like we go back and we move back and forth in that, like, so the first piece with the girl sort of moving through the landscape is kind of like a visualization of that kind of idea, where she's going through the rocks and nature and sort of and moving, and she's a dancer. She was like a young dancer, and so that movement, it was important to me to have somebody who understood her body as she climbed and walked in these spaces, because I didn't want it to be sort of, even though we just said to her, we'll walk through this space, because she had sort of like a presence and an understanding of her body, she moved with a different kind of weight. So I'm always sort of interested in kind of like the weight that we carry when we go through these spaces. You know, the new project I'm working on is thinking about how, muscle memory, how people used to hike through the hills and how they don't move anymore, and that kind of, that connection to land. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but like I said, you can give me details. I probably messed up your answer, but I can probably give you a better one. I don't know of any studies. I think one of the things with my work especially, I'll make work about something, and then someone writes a book about it like 10 years later, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and then I go like, oh, is that what I was doing? And so in that sense, I think like if you're creating, I think you go where the work pulls you, right? Like a part of it is staying open to, like when I went to New Orleans, I went with the idea of talking about land loss and saltwater inundation. When I got there, the land was telling me like I build as well. Like it's not all collapse, right? It's also being built somewhere else. So what you think is absence is actually being constructed somewhere else, and maybe it's your perception, or maybe where you're looking on the map, kind of a thing, right? And so that it was creating new land where there was no land existing on any maps at that moment. And so I had to be open to the work, to see that and recognize that for what it was, as opposed to sort of this idea that I had formed when I went to film it. So in that sense, if you're working on something, work on it, because sometimes the work teaches you, what it is. It gives you the vocabulary that you didn't know you didn't have.
Great, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, audience. Again, Deborah Jack, we have on view through February 15th, and your ticket does get you free admission into the museum, so we do encourage you to come check that out. And then stay tuned as our new exhibition will open up on March 5th. So appreciate you all. Thank you for being here tonight. Get home safely.